Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
This morning we're going to hear from Ms. Burton.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you'd like to stand, please. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down.
Thank you very much. Can you give your full name, please?
Amanda Jane Burton.
Ms. Burton, you should have in front of you a witness statement dated the 3rd of September of this year. Is that right?
That's right.
Could I ask you to have a look at the final substantive page, please?
Yes,
Is it dated the 3rd of September?
it is.
And is that your signature?
It is.
Can you confirm that, as at the date of signature, that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm that.
Thank you. I think you've told me in advance that there may be some subsequent developments which cause you to reflect on some matters that you have addressed in your witness statement, but the statement itself is true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
It is.
Thank you. That witness statement has the unique reference number of WITN 11330100 and will be published on the inquiry's website shortly. By way of background, you are a qualified solicitor, is that right?
Yes, I am.
You have a wide range of business experience in public companies, and you've set those out in your witness statement. And that includes as Global Chief Operating Officer of Clifford Chance, is that correct?
That is.
And you retired from Clifford Chance in 2014.
I did.
And subsequently have been developing a portfolio of non-executive director positions.
Correct.
And you have recently also become chair of a publicly listed distribution company.
I have.
Thank you. Relevant for today's purpose, you were appointed a post office non-executive director in April 2023. Is that
Yes.
right? Thank you. I want to begin just by asking you a little bit about your appointment. Could we bring onto screen, please, poll 0036349? We're going to be looking at your letter of appointment dated the 27th of April of 2023. Thank you. If we scroll over to page 3, please, and it's paragraph 2.1, it sets out there the time commitment as non-executive director. And the appointment letter says you will be expected to devote such time as is necessary for the proper performance of your duties as a director. Overall, we anticipate that you will spend a minimum of 24 days per year, each year on work for the company, following the induction phase. In practice, how much time do you spend in this role?
A great deal more than 24 days.
Do you think that the minimum of 24 days as set out there was realistic?
No, although some things happened, for instance, my review of the bonus scheme that nobody could have foreseen at the time I was appointed.
If we put to one side work on the inquiry, work on the fallout to the matters relating to the Horizon issues, nevertheless, do you think that that is a correct period of time for the role?
Normally, you'd anticipate as a non-executive director to spend around up to 30 days a year on a particular role. And if this was a stable organisation, I would expect that to be about the right time.
And are we to read into that that it's your view that it's not a stable organisation?
Correct.
One matter that we've dealt with in previous phases was the issue of overboarding. Do you feel that you have sufficient time, and do you feel that other members of the board have sufficient time?
I think we definitely find that post office is the most time-consuming one in each of our portfolios, but I think we're all professional enough to be able to manage the workload.
Do you have any concerns in respect of any other members of the board?
No. Other than the postmaster Neds, actually, because they're also running full-time businesses. And so I do think it's a particular strain for them to also sit on the board.
Thank you. That can come down. You became chair of the Remuneration Committee on the 26th of May of 2023, so as good as straight away or very soon into your time on the board. I think you've said in your witness statement that you were always going to take that role, but it was brought forward, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And why was it brought forward?
It was brought forward because I was asked to undertake a review of a particular bonus scheme very shortly after I joined the board. And as a result of that review, it was decided that I would take over the chair of the Remuneration Committee a month earlier.
And the review concerned something called the Transformation Incentive Scheme. Can you assist us with what the Transformation Incentive Scheme was?
It was designed as a one-off bonus scheme, and it was put in place during the time of the pandemic, when it was difficult, as was the case with a lot of companies, to determine the financial health of the organisation, etc., and therefore more difficult to put in place certain financial metrics. So this was put in place for other purposes and replaced the normal annual bonus scheme.
And why did there need to be a review of that scheme?
Because one of the sub-metrics had some wording in that was not actually correct, which related to this inquiry. And it had, the wording assumed that Sir Wynne would be reviewing the outturn of the metric.
Thank you. Perhaps the best place to see that is poll 003635154. This is a document we're going to come back to, but if I could just take you to page 3 of this, it's a Simmons and Simmons report, and we'll get to that in due course. But it sets out there in a table the bonus metric. It's page 3. Thank you. So was it concerning the table that we see if we scroll down to paragraph 1.4?
That's correct, yes.
And the wording there, this is from taken from the annual report. It stated, delivery of all the required information and support for the Horizon inquiry, satisfying the requirements of Sir Wynne Williams, ensuring there is a clear, measurable plan created to demonstrate action on improving the overall culture to be postmaster-centric and to ensure processes for postmasters are addressed in line with recommendations from the inquiry. Any actions or plans must have been endorsed by the inquiry and the board. And then it says, inquiry support is the metric, and it sets out there a target, all required evidence and information supplied on time with confirmation from Sir Wynne Williams and team that Post Office's performance supported and enabled the inquiry to finish in line with expectations, and it set out that that outcome had been achieved. In simple terms, what was the issue with this?
Well, the issue was that during the time of this plan, the inquiry became a statutory inquiry, and clearly the onus on people to provide evidence changed considerably, and it would not have been appropriate at all to have any suggestion that Sir Wynne would be involved in a bonus scheme.
Is there a broader issue, not simply that it was based on the inquiry before it was a statutory inquiry, but irrespective of the status of the inquiry, do you see any issue with performance being and a bonus being based on compliance with an investigation into wrongdoing by the company?
I understand. I wasn't in the post office when this was set, but I understand the rationale was to ensure that the team were fully engaged with the inquiry and absolutely had to deliver what was required of them. Definitely, in hindsight, this would not have been appropriate, regardless of whether it was a public or statutory inquiry, but I understood that to be the reason for it.
Thank you. That can come down. When you were conducting your review of this, Were you aware of the background to the Horizon issues?
Yes, I had been following it just as a member of the public has been as well. And I was obviously horrified by what had been happening and very distressed around the issues that the postmasters and postmistresses faced. I had that element of knowledge. I literally had only just joined the post office, so I hadn't really started my induction by the time I was asked to do this review. So my further knowledge didn't really happen till later on.
We heard evidence earlier this week from Saf Ismail, one of the non-executive director postmasters. And in his view, there are a number of people on the board, he said, who didn't really appreciate the extent of the scandal until the ITV drama. Were you one of those people?
No.
Do you think that you had a sufficient grip at the time that you were investigating these issues on the seriousness of the underlying matters?
I believe so, yes.
Were you, at the time that you were carrying out the review, aware of other ongoing disputes regarding the quantum of bonuses among senior executives?
I had had one meeting with the chair of the Remuneration Committee shortly after I joined, and she informed me of some of the discussions that had taken place in the past. So I did have some knowledge of some of the issues that had been happening.
And can you give us an idea of those kinds of issues?
That there had been requests to the shareholder for an increase in the pay of the chief executive.
And in your view, was that relevant background to the review that you carried out?
At that stage, no, because I was purely looking at the appropriateness of this metric and how it had come about.
Looking back now at the work that you carried out and the information you know now about various disputes regarding bonuses or other income, would you have carried out your review differently?
I don't think so, no.
Do you think your conclusions would have been any different?
No.
Could we please turn to Bays 0000655? This is an email note of a meeting with Minister Hollenrake of the 22nd of May 2023. And I'm just going to read to you a few passages from it. If we scroll down, we see the attendees. It then says HS, so that's Mr. Staunton, the chair of the post office, expressed how disappointed he was regarding the bonus payment issue at the submetric, which referred to the inquiry. He has confidence in Amanda Burton as the new REMCO chair and values her judgment. She has produced her report, which the board have had sight of today. If we scroll up slightly, we can see this was the 22nd of May. Can you assist us? Was that a draft version of the report at that stage?
Yes, it would have been.
Yes. Can you recall when you were first asked to write the report or to investigate the matters?
Right at the beginning of May.
So you had been working on this for 3 weeks or so?
Yes.
Amanda is satisfied that the decision to introduce the submetric wasn't an unreasonable one to take, given that the inquiry was at this time non-statutory. Just pausing there, I think from your evidence today, I think you take a slightly broader view on that.
Yes, I think, as I say, I was so new into the post office at the time that I was taking certain things at face value, and in fact this is the first time I've been involved in an inquiry, so I was still very much learning at that point.
Yes. Who in particular had briefed you?
I actually didn't really receive any brief as such. I just asked to see as many documents as I possibly could in order to make up my own mind. I was conscious that there were certain people who might be conflicted in the outcome, So I was careful not to talk to too many people.
The shareholder was involved throughout and there was appropriate governance. In Mr. Staunton's view, the wording which said that Sir Win approved it was a huge mistake, and he is baffled that it went through so many clearances without being picked up on. Do you share that bafflement?
Yes, still to this day, I do not know how the wording was not picked up, and particularly when it went into the report and accounts.
If we scroll down, please, we see towards the bottom of the page, it says DB, and that's David Bickerton, the Director General of the Department for Business and Trade. DB said that the most recent issue was the third time that mistakes have been made at the Post Office related to senior management compensation. The review, which DBT is commissioning, will look into whether there are more deep-rooted issues here. Were you aware that this was the third time that mistakes had been made by the Post Office?
I had been told that there had been some mistakes, yes.
Were you aware then, or are you aware now of what those other two mistakes were?
I certainly recall one was in relation to the enhancement that the Chief Executive and Finance Director can get in certain circumstances, and that although the Remuneration Committee had approved the change and had requested that the Chief People Officer ensure that the appropriate approval from the shareholder took place, that approval did not take place. So I'm certainly aware of that one.
And do you have an idea what the other one was?
I can't recall, I'm sorry.
At the bottom, we see Minister Hollinrake mentioned that Mr. Staunton asked previously to effectively double Nick Reed's pay. Minister Hollinrake said that he was not willing to agree to this, as not only is the Post Office publicly owned, but it is also under huge financial pressures. Minister Hollinrake asked Henry Staunton if this request came from Mr. Reed, and Mr. Staunton said that this isn't the case. Again, was that something that you were aware of?
I wasn't aware about the request to double pay, but I knew there had been discussions around Mr. Reed's pay.
We may hear evidence next week from Mr. Staunton to the effect that Mr. Reed was obsessed with his pay. What's your view on that?
He certainly did take an interest in his pay. That is absolutely correct, yes.
I mean, everybody takes an interest in their pay. A beyond average interest, unusual interest?
Yes, I would have said, considering the background against which we were operating, when I would have considered it was a highly sensitive matter, and we needed to be more circumspect. I think sometimes Mr. Reed did ask for information about his pay and bonus opportunity, etc., which I might not have expected.
Looking at the range of issues here that we've just seen, if we scroll back to the previous page, the reference to the third time that mistakes have been made, the underlying issues that you were investigating, do you think it is common or uncommon for a business of the Post Office's size to have these kinds of issues?
It's uncommon, but most organisations do not run remuneration committees in the way this one is set up.
And can you assist us with what you mean by that?
In public companies, normally what happens is that your policy is reviewed every 3 years and approved by shareholders, and then you're entitled to operate within that policy. You do not need to go back to shareholders each time you want to make a pay rise, for example, provided it's within the policy. Here, we're very restricted and have to go to the shareholder if we want to change anything.
And when you say the shareholder, do you mean the Department for Business?
Yes.
And do you see that as a problem?
It makes it more complicated and, as I say, more unusually restrictive for the committee. So it's something that I've certainly had to get up to speed on in the way that this organisation operates. And there are a lot of rules and regulations that we have to follow, such as managing public money, etc. And it is very complex. So in the end, I had to have drafted a table showing exactly at what point we need consent for what.
We may get to it, but in due course, the chair will have to be making recommendations. Is there anything that you would recommend to overcome that issue?
I think it would, I think first of all, one of the things we have been missing is a very clear strategy, and normally strategy sets the direction for bonuses and for setting metrics and long-term bonuses as well. With the lack of that, we have struggled somewhat to put in place appropriate metrics, and I'm really looking forward to having that resolved through the current strategic review, because I think once we have a clear direction, it'll be much easier for the Remuneration Committee to set sensible targets.
I appreciate this is a difficult question to answer, but do you think the executive pay at the post office is sufficient?
I think it depends from whose perspective you're looking at. I think from the postmaster's perspective, it certainly would look to be more than sufficient. If you are running a charity, for example, and obviously we have a clear social purpose, it would be more than sufficient. If you are running a public company, then it would be less sufficient. So I think it depends on the circumstances.
Do you think it's sufficient to attract somebody of a good enough calibre, good enough quality to lead the organisation?
Some people definitely would not be attracted because of the package. It would put people off. Others might be more attracted because of the social purpose of the post office. So just like you can get fantastic chief executives running charities, they don't necessarily do it for the pay. They're doing it for other reasons. So I think you have to look in the market in a particular way.
And in your view, looking forward to the future, is it sufficient?
I would hope so. As I say, I think the constraints on what we're able to do might put people off. So, for instance, normally you'd expect to be able to give a regular salary increase in line with the overall workforce. Here we're not able to do that. We have to keep going back for consent. So I would hope, as part of the discussions around the future of the post office, we might be able to come to a more sensible arrangement where we take some of the issues away from the sort of adversarial nature between ourselves and the shareholder.
Thank you. On the same topic, and still dealing with issues of the involvement of the Department for Business, can we please have a look at Bays 0000656, please? This is still addressing your report, your review. We're now on the 25th of May. It's another meeting with Minister Hollenrake. If we scroll down, please. We see there are a number of people in attendance, including Lorna Grattan, the UK GI Director and the Non-Executive Director shareholder. There is a section at the beginning of the meeting that addresses the bonus issue. Can we scroll? Thank you. NR, so Mr. Reid explained that the Post Office Board had an emergency meeting last night to review the report written by Amanda Burton, the new chair of REMCO, into the issue. He summarised the main themes of discussion during the board meeting. I'd just like to take those one by one. LG, so that's Lorna Grattan, pushed hard for yourself to change the tone of the report so that it shows more remorse. And you said that you would reflect on it. What do you recall of that conversation?
There was a board meeting where I presented my draft report to the board, and a number of comments were made, not just from Ms. Grattan, but from others as well. And I was very keen to ensure that this was my report and put in my words. So that's why I said I would reflect on it. It wasn't meaning to say that I didn't agree that, the tone was right or not right, but I just wanted to make sure that the words were mine.
And did you amend the report following that discussion?
I did.
Can you give us, we'll look at the report shortly, you don't have to give us the exact words, but what kind of thing did you change?
Certainly I reviewed the actions following the comments made, and I think I made 1 or 2 changes to the action plan.
In terms of the overall tone, though, did you change that?
I did, yes.
And how?
I put in the wording that you see now in relation to that the metric was entirely inappropriate.
The second bullet point, the chair was keen that the report has clear actions, and Ms Gretton pushed for one of them to be removing the bonus metrics to do with the inquiry.
That's correct.
And was that implemented?
Yes.
Third, there was lively debate about handing back the bonus. Mr Reid had spoken to everybody involved, suggested that they return the money. From a legal perspective, the approach will be voluntary, not mandatory. Mr Reid will engage with the SMT further on this and provide an update. Were you aware of what the lively debate was?
I think it was more a discussion as to whether we could rely on clawback or not. Mr Reid did express concerns that people were being asked to hand back their bonus, but actually everybody did so.
And was it a lively debate? Lively suggests that there was strong differences of opinion or strong views.
Not from my recollection, no, not in that respect, no.
Could we please turn to RLIT 40342? And this is your final report. Is that right?
Correct.
If we scroll down slightly, we can see on that first main paragraph under what has been reviewed, it says at the final sentence of that paragraph, following submission of the report to Minister Hollenrake on the 26th of May 2023, some additional clarification has been requested, and this final report reflects that clarification where I have been able to give it. Can you assist us with what that was addressing?
Yes, the Minister did make some comments, and I'm sorry, I now can't recall entirely what they were, but I again reflected on them. But as I say, I was very keen to make sure this was my report. On coming into the business and being new in the business, was this level of involvement from the shareholder non-executive, from the Minister, did that strike you as unusual in any way? Yes, I was quite surprised by it.
Did you have any concerns in that regard?
My concern was that I am an independent non-executive director and I wanted to remain so. And the reason that I'd been asked to do this report was because I was completely new to the organisation and didn't come with any knowledge of the personalities involved, etc. And I wanted to retain that independence.
And
You may have already mentioned this, but was it Mr. Staunton personally who asked you to do it, or a number of people involved, or what?
Yes, it was Mr. Staunton, yes.
Yeah, fine, thanks.
Thank you. From this experience, can you assist us with anything to do with the culture vis-a-vis, for example, the shareholder or the Department for Business more broadly?
It certainly seemed quite a difficult relationship, I think, because of some of the mistakes that had happened in the past and now this as well. I think the department had lost confidence in the ability of people within Post Office to manage remuneration issues.
So on the one hand, as you've described, you had more involvement by shareholder and government than in other companies you're used to. But at the same time, there was a feeling amongst that shareholder that things hadn't been going right.
Correct.
Could we please turn to page 7, bottom of page 6 onto page 7? Sorry, I'll skip through, but there's a whole section there that sets out the timeline and your views as to how things progressed over time and how it was that the metric became inserted and accepted. We then move to findings. I'm just going to take you paragraph by paragraph here. If we scroll down slightly, I think the first finding is essentially that it was a one-off scheme, and that's something you've already set out for us. Paragraph 2, you highlight issues there with clarity, is that right?
Correct, yes.
And what were those issues, briefly?
The scheme was overcomplicated, and there were far too many metrics. Normally, remuneration committees prefer to have very clear line of sight and very short, few number of metrics. There were too many. It was very complicated in terms of how they were going to be reviewed. It was almost like a complete industry going on in the background, which I would not normally expect to see.
Was that in any way symptomatic of other issues within the business that you've experienced?
I do think the business can be very bureaucratic, and things take a long time as a result. And there are sometimes, a lack of clear line of sight as to what you're attempting to achieve, which does cause confusion.
If we scroll down to paragraph 3, I'll just read from paragraph 3. It says, however, the wording of the first submetric was completely inappropriate once the inquiry was placed on a statutory footing and the timelines moved considerably. Was that wording that you had added following the conversation that we've just seen, or was that there before?
That was there before.
In hindsight, it was clearly inaccurate to suggest that Sir Wynne would be in any way involved in determining whether any part of the bonus had been achieved. There was no deliberate intention on anyone's part to mislead the role of Sir Wynne in this matter. Do you think you had a sufficient evidential basis to reach that conclusion?
As far as I could tell, there was no deliberate intention. As I say, I was doing this on my own. I had no support, and I didn't want to particularly talk. I know it may sound very strange, but I didn't particularly want to talk to the individuals involved because I was just concerned that people would have their own perspective, which might then cloud my judgment. So I very much relied on the documents.
Because I think one of the other findings, either in this report or in the Simmons and Simmons report, is that there was a fundamental lack of documentation of the entire process. Given that finding, and given that you didn't speak to anybody, do you think that you had a sufficient basis to reach that conclusion?
As far as I can tell.
Looking back at it now, are you content with that conclusion, or would you have put it differently?
I have not come across anything that suggests to me that anybody was deliberately misleading.
Thank you. It then says, having said that, numerous people, both inside and outside the post office, saw the wording over many months, and no one questioned it. The wording was substantially the same in the letter to the Permanent Secretary, the February 2022 REMCO and the DRR. I do not find the grouping of the 6 submetrics into 4 as being material. The next paragraph, paragraph 4, essentially finds that the shareholder was involved in the process. Is that a fair, rough summary of that paragraph?
UKGI, yes, and the shareholder itself also signed off the bonus. As I say, everything has to be signed off by the shareholder, and this did go through a process and was signed off by the shareholder.
And then paragraph 5, my summary of it is that it should have been revisited once it was obvious that it no longer applied, but it wasn't deliberate. Is that a fair summary? Is there something else that you would add in summary of paragraph 5?
No, as I say, it continues to be a mystery to me as to why nobody spotted the problem, but I have not discovered anything that would suggest it was deliberate.
Thank you. And if we turn over the page, please. We have conclusions and recommendations if we scroll down. In conclusion, the rationale for the TIS looks sound, and the shareholder was consulted in July 2021. Again, revisiting that from the evidence you gave earlier today, I think you have a slightly more nuanced position than the fact that it looks sound.
In relation to that submetric, yes.
Yes. However, the TIS became too complex with 17 submetrics and many people involved in the drafting and approval process over a long period of time. It's difficult to understand why the inquiry first submetric was not questioned by anyone and yet seen by so many people. However, having taken into account the discretion available to REMCO and the confirmation I've received that REMCO considered that there had been very good progress in supporting the inquiry, I consider that the decision made should be taken in that light. In essence, the committee exercised their discretion irrespective of the fact that it wasn't met in any event. Is that your finding?
Correct, yes.
If we scroll over the page, you set out a list of recommendations. One of them, the first one, variable pay schemes, whether short-term or long-term, need to be simple, transparent and clear. Two, the timeline between the initial proposal design and approval of variable pay schemes needs to be shortened, as it does not make sense to have schemes being debated months, even a year after the awards should have been made. Three, when assessing whether metrics have been achieved, there needs to be a clear audit trail. Four, the REMCO must assess whether any metrics remain valid if circumstances change. Five, REMCO needs to be mindful of all stakeholders when putting in place new schemes, when determining the outturn, and when reporting on reward in the DRR. Six, Post Office needs to re-engage with the shareholder. Just reading the REMCO minutes and background information, I can see that a large amount of time is taken in schemes being drafted at a detailed level, but I think we need better engagement at the macro level. Seven, the REMCO will review the terms of the 2022-2023 STIP when it meets later in June, and I will be recommending that REMCO exercises its discretion not to award the element of bonus specifically relating to the inquiry. Have those proposals been implemented?
Most have. I would say number 6 is the one that we need to work on. But that would make most sense once we have a clear strategy which hopefully will be agreed by the shareholder, because I think then that will put into context what we hope to achieve through bonus schemes.
Thank you. In terms of an apology, I understand that there was an apology to the inquiry. Did there need to be an apology to sub-postmasters?
Yes.
And why do you say that?
Because this did cause unnecessary distress. It just means that Post Office once again looks as though it's not listening and not being sympathetic and understanding of the issues.
Are you aware of an apology being issued to sub-postmasters?
I do believe that on the website there was some information addressed to the postmasters from memory.
Do you think enough was done to apologise to sub-postmasters in respect of this particular issue?
Probably not.
Could we please turn to poll 00447-839, please? This is a Remuneration Committee evaluation report produced on the 3rd of July 2023, so after the production of your review. Can you give us a little bit of background to why this was produced?
Yes, it's perfectly normal practice every year to review the board itself and each committee. This was an evaluation done before I joined, so this report came to this committee, but it had already taken place. And the purpose of this was to look at what the proposed actions were.
If we scroll down to the recommendations, so these recommendations had already been drafted before your report, had they?
They had.
And in some ways, they're consistent with your report.
Correct.
So if we look at paragraph 1, it's recommended the committee focus greater efforts to ensure that remuneration structures and packages are simplified. And that coincides with one of your recommendations.
That's correct.
The quality of papers / presentations submitted to the committee from management require improvement. Do you know what went wrong here prior to your time? That there were such difficulties in the paper trail?
There had been a churn of chief people officers and people in their teams as well. And so I think there was just a lack of memory, and new people turning up all the time meant that things got lost. And clearly, it's important to document things, have good minutes, and minutes that reflect the decisions. And I just think some things got rushed through and were poor quality.
An issue that we've been looking at in previous phases is a potential failure to pass on information to people who come into the business. Is this a wider concern that you have?
Yes, the board is very new, for example, and so we don't have the corporate memory, and therefore we're having to rely on others quite a lot. And you wouldn't expect to see the churn of staff that we are seeing for understandable reasons, but it does make it harder, and it makes it harder to get that paper trail.
And is this simply a fallout of a historic scandal, or is there something wider that you're concerned about within the business that leads to those issues?
I think the post office is under a lot of stress as an organisation, not just because of the inquiry and what the awful things that have happened in the past, but just also it's at a bit of a crossroads in terms of its future, and that even in a stable organisation would cause some issues.
If we scroll down, please, to page 5. We can see at paragraph 10, or in box 10, please include any thoughts you have about the operation of the committee and any ideas for its future operation. It says more to do to get a better timetable of decision making, more to go to balance reward fairness and affordability, more to go to simplify reward structures. Trust needs to continue to be built between the executive and the committee. A focus on engagement / listening / incentivization would be helpful. The interplay with shareholder approval remains a significant working issue for the committee. In particular, the level of approvals required for any executive board comp. Was this drafted before your report?
Yes, I think these are comments from individual members of the Remuneration Committee.
And does this in some way coincide with the concerns that you've already raised?
Correct.
There seems to be much merit in trying to simplify the incentive plans, and it's this last paragraph that I'd like to spend a bit of time on. The appointment of a new head of HR provides an opportunity to reset the relationship with the committee. It must be recognised that the environment in which the company is operating and pressures it is under, both internal and external, make the job of the HR team and Remco difficult. What do you understand by those concerns about the environment?
It's acknowledging that people are under stress and how you continue to motivate them, not necessarily through pay, but in other ways, and to ensure that people stay and do a good job.
Turnover in the HR team also means corporate memory is sometimes missing. However, It has been disappointing that some decisions which should have been taken at Remco have not, e.g. certain senior exec exit packages. Can you assist us with that, please?
I actually can't. I don't know what that is particularly referring to.
Are you aware of any individuals amongst the former executive team being paid when exiting the company and authorisations hadn't been through the usual channels?
With the help of people in HR, I have, and actually Mr. Ismail also prompted me to have a look at some particular examples. Unfortunately, a lot of these people, because they'd left, I obviously didn't know them and wasn't necessarily sure where to look. But we looked through the documents just to check whether there had been issues with whether the Remuneration Committee should have signed off or not. The ones that I saw, I could see that the Remuneration Committee had been consulted. Some of the decisions looked potentially a bit odd, but they had been consulted.
In broad terms, what was odd about the decisions?
Just in the way that some of the exit packages were proposed. But as I say, a discussion had clearly gone through the Remuneration Committee. I didn't sit on it at that time. I assume they had good reasons for agreeing to the proposals.
In addition, the process of STIP, LTIP design continues to a problem. More interaction before the end of the previous financial year would speed up framework design and would help with the creation and presentation of the supporting papers on the metrics themselves. As a result, the quality of Remco papers has been poor and decisions delayed for too long. Again, that's much in line with your evidence so far.
Correct.
Could we please turn to poll 00448-606? We're now moving to the 5th of August of this year, and this is an email from yourself to the Postmaster Non-Executive Directors. And you say, further to your email of the 26th of July, I have had a look back through Remco meetings and also got some further information from Nick Marriott. All of the below happened when Angela Williams was Chief People Officer. Most of the arrangements were signed off by Remco, although having gone through the papers, I think that they sometimes lack clarity and there wasn't consistent sign-off. You say, as you know, Ian and I have worked hard to put in place better governance around senior pay, and we are all determined to learn from the past. Is this the email that you were just referring to?
Correct.
Can you assist us, insofar as you haven't already covered it, what the governance concerns were regarding senior pay?
Just following the policies and procedures. So sometimes retrospective approval had to be given, which wouldn't normally happen. And I just think some of the proposals could have been better thought through. But as I say, I've found that the Remco was aware that Remco is only responsible for very senior pay packages. So there will be people that fall below this. But as I say, I think that there clearly needs to be a tightening up of the processes, more clarity on the policies. We have been doing all that. I would hope that we are in a better place.
What do you see as the cause of that issue?
I think, again, it is a sign of an organisation under some stress, and a sign of the fact that some people were interims. So Mrs. Williams, for example, was an interim. I say lack of corporate memory, and I think also just a lack of understanding of the environment in which we were operating.
Can we now turn to that Simmons & Simmons review? That's at poll 003635154. It's the August 2023 review that was carried out. Can you assist us with a bit of background to why this was carried out?
This was carried out at the request of Minister Hollingrakes, so this was not a Post Office report. This was done by the government, and it was they were instructed pretty shortly after I was also asked to do my review, but their conclusions came out later.
And can you assist us with why there were the two reviews, then your review and this review?
I'm afraid I wasn't party to the decision on Simmons and Simmons, because I say it was outside the Post Office. I'm guessing it would have been because of this lack of trust in relation to what was happening in the Post Office.
And do you agree with the findings in this report?
We come at our conclusions in a different way, but I think we both conclude in similar fashion.
Perhaps we'll go through a few recommendations and a few findings, and we can see. If we turn over the page, please, we can see the background over the page again. Thank you. We've been asked by the Minister to conduct an independent review into the governance practices of and decisions made by the Post Office's Remuneration Committee in relation to the remuneration metric known as the inquiry support target. And if we scroll down, that's the section that I took you to earlier. The summary of findings can be found on page 4. They say, before addressing our findings, it's important to note that the inquiry moved onto a statutory footing on the 1st of June 2021 and was from that point anticipated to finish in the autumn of 2022. Neither REMCO nor the Post Office Human Resources appear to have recognised the significance of this change, and particularly the consequences that the performance that the inquiry support target incentivised would now be compelled by law. Had that been considered and appropriately addressed by REMCO, then the issues that we have considered in this review would not have arisen because the target would likely not have been approved, either at all or certainly not in its final form. A number of those we have spoken with have acknowledged that in hindsight. Is that a finding that you agree with?
I do.
Yes. If we scroll down, thank you. At 1.13, findings in relation to the Post Office's governance around remuneration. From the evidence we have seen, we conclude that there are aspects of the Post Office's governance around remuneration that would benefit from further consideration and enhancement because they do not align with best practice for a private corporation. However, those findings ought to be balanced against the fact that the Post Office is a public corporation and therefore has particular requirements that are different to those of a private corporation. Our recommendations are therefore focused on maximising the effectiveness of the Post Office's governance around remuneration. Do you agree with that?
I do.
Is there a tension there between the two?
There is to some extent, yes. We do try and comply with the Code on Corporate Governance, which is designed for private corporations and public limited companies. But there are certain issues which we can't comply with. For instance, the makeup of the Remuneration Committee members. And as I say, we have to go consistently to the shareholder for approval for any changes.
And is that a problem?
I just think it does create extra work and perhaps extra focus on pay, which, to be honest, we don't need. I think if there was more flexibility done in a proper way and absolutely aligned to a strategy, that would really assist.
Thank you. If we scroll down, I'm just going to skip through these findings quite quickly. Findings in relation to the inquiry support target. Because there's more than one way in which to interpret the target, we consider there was a justifiable basis on which REMCO could decide that it had been achieved, and there was therefore a justifiable basis on which to make the award. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
The Post Office is not able to evidence the basis on which REMCO awarded the bonuses, including the inquiry support target, because there are no written records of the rationale for its decision, and the recollections of those involved are inconclusive. This means that it is practically impossible to ascertain the basis for Remco's decision in respect of the inquiry support target. The fact that Remco's decision-making was not better recorded is a clear governance failing, including on the part of the Remco members who should have identified that the minutes were deficient. Do you agree with that?
I do.
And does that concern you?
Well, it was clearly something that needed to be rectified, because I think you always have to ensure that the documents are there so that when you hand over to the next person, it's very clear why those decisions were made.
At 1.17, we have also concluded that the Post Office intended the inquiry support target to be validated internally, and we have found that it did not intend for a confirmation specific to this target to be obtained from Sir Wyn Williams or his team. The language of the inquiry support target was not considered or discussed in the course of Remco preparing the Director's remuneration report, which Remco approved for inclusion in the annual report and accounts, etc. I think you've said that your conclusions are slightly different to these. What do you see as the fundamental difference between the two here?
They were broadly the same. I think they just added one or two more, which we adopted as part of the Remuneration Committee. And we've also tracked now the recommendations from the Grant Thornton report as well, which came out later.
Thank you. So we see below here the summary of recommendations. Have you taken forward those recommendations?
Yes.
If we scroll over the page, we can see some more. Again, do you feel that you have sufficiently implemented those recommendations?
Yes, we have.
Could we please turn to poll 004483990? We're moving now to the 23rd of April of this year, and this is an email that we've seen before with Mr. Ismail. It's an email chain where you emailed the two non-executive director sub-postmasters. If we scroll down, we can see you say, I welcome your views on the following. The Remuneration Committee is discussing what would be the most appropriate metrics for the long-term incentive scheme. We've asked management whether there is a target we could put in to improve the customer experience or improve footfall. If we scroll up, we can see the response from Mr. Ismail. He says, I have received your email and I appreciate the opportunity to provide input on the subject. In regards to the long-term incentive plan, I suggest the following factors. 1, postmaster profitability, postmaster remuneration percentage increase, reduction in central overhead costs, increase in footfall that leads to profitability, commercial deals made over the period and their payback, postmaster survey results over the last 3 years, cultural change from the postmaster's perspective. I'm disappointed with the management suggestion, as postmasters have limited control over customer complaints and they are aware of this. I'm willing to discuss this further and would like to know if it's possible to have similar input for the short-term incentive plan. Can you assist us with the background to this email exchange?
Yes, the Remuneration Committee had been looking at the targets for the long-term incentive scheme and felt that we ought to have one in that related to customers, because we are obviously a customer-facing business. It proved remarkably difficult to receive some sensible proposals, and eventually the retail team suggested one to do with customer complaints. The Remuneration Committee was rather surprised by this and didn't feel that this would be an appropriate metric. And I took it upon myself to ask Mr. Ismail and Mr. Elliott and Mr. Jacobs myself, because I really valued their input, which was why this email was sent. So I did it as an open question because I just wanted to test whether my thoughts were correct.
And what's your view of his proposals?
Some of these are actually already in the short-term incentive scheme, so some are more appropriate for short-term schemes and some of them are in the long-term scheme. So it was good to see that broadly, we were, even though he wasn't aware of the details, that we were in agreement.
Looking at, for example, those final 2 bullet points, do you think that there is a sufficient emphasis on postmasters' feedback on cultural change?
Certainly in the metrics, there are metrics to do with the postmaster survey results, and there have been for a while, actually. It's not just the current schemes. I think when we determine the strategy, it will be much clearer to look at the cultural changes. That's what I talked about before. I think we've been a little bit hampered by the fact that we haven't got a clear strategy.
We've heard some evidence that a slightly rosy picture is painted of the postmaster survey results amongst the board. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And has that happened?
Sorry.
The first question was, are you aware of that complaint?
Yes.
Are you aware of it actually happening?
That there's a rosy picture?
Yes.
I do think that when the last postmaster survey was presented to the board, it was perhaps done in a light that did look a little skewed. Whereas when you read the actual survey results, you could see that the views of postmasters were quite polarised, and I think more should have been done to bring those out to the board meeting. Although, as I say, we actually did see the results ourselves.
Why do you think it is that a rosy picture is painted of those kinds of things at board level?
You'd probably have to ask the people who presented what was in their minds, but I'm sometimes what can happen is that people do feel that they are expected to give a positive outlook on things, but it's important that the board sees the background papers and is able to challenge.
I want to move on to the topic of whistleblowing and you as the Speak Up champion. You've been Speak Up champion since August of 2023, is that right?
That's correct.
Perhaps we can just have a look at a document by way of background. It's poll 00448-689. This is an email to Mr. Staunton that just predates your time as Speak Up champion. Can you just assist us with what a Speak Up champion is?
Yes, the Post Office has decided, as part of the recommendations that came out of the judgments, that there should be a board member who is Speak Up champion. And the role is not to do the investigations myself, although, as I'm sure we'll come on, there is one exception to that, but to ensure that the policies and processes are properly run, and that the board has confidence that people feel able to speak up, and that they know the channels in which they can speak up, and that there will be no detriment to them if they do speak up.
Thank you. This email is from somebody calling themselves John Doe. It would be a remarkable coincidence if that was their actual name. It looks like an anonymous whistleblowing email, or an email that's entitled whistleblowing. It's Mr. Staunton, and it says as follows: I'm writing to you directly because I don't trust the Post Office whistleblowing process, and escalations into Nick Reed have not been dealt with. This email will also be sent to Sir Wyn Williams and Darren Jones. The disaster of NBIT is well known across different levels within the business. Recently, a number of people have raised concerns to Nick Reed that have been ignored. More than one individual is aware and has told Nick the board have been told untruths by the NBIT team and the Chief Information Officer about the extent of defects and timescales for R2 rollout that now won't be delivered until August, if then. So this email at the first instance raises concerns about the NBIT programme. Were those concerns that you were aware of prior to seeing this document?
I knew that there were concerns as to whether the timetable would be achieved and that the costs were increasing.
If we scroll down, there are concerns raised about the governance in place for NBIT. If we scroll over the page, please. The letter says, anyone who questions the CIO or program director are badged as difficult and troublemakers, when in reality it's a case of having the experience to see the mistakes being made and wanting to do the right thing. These people are bullied either into staying quiet or there are campaigns to undermine them. This is exactly what happened in the past when people too scared to speak up and say what's really going on because of the repercussions even from Nick. So there's a complaint there about bullying. Is that right?
Yes.
If we scroll down to the final paragraph, there's a complaint there about criticism of the Chief Information Officer again, suggesting that he's open about misleading the board with inaccurate dates and costs for NBIT and is incapable of making a decision or having a difficult conversation. Could we scroll over the page, please? There's criticism directly of Mr. Reid again. Nick Reid has openly acknowledged and accepted the failings of some of his group executive team to more than one employee that's been to him to express concerns, but has taken no action to deal with it. He's also aware of toxic behaviour from senior leaders and again does nothing to address it, even when he's witnessed it directly. He refuses to make the difficult decisions and nods along when people raise concerns, saying everything they want to hear, but then does nothing to resolve it. He is aware he has senior people in role not doing what they should, like Jeff Smith, and again does nothing to manage or deal with it, even though it's a waste of public money. There's then a concern raised about the culture of the business regarding treatment of junior and female employees. If we scroll down, there's another paragraph of more criticism of Mr. Reid. Nick made comments last week to the senior team about the horrific behaviours of the people who were part of the Horizon debacle, especially if they're still in the business. He doesn't seem to see how much of this is still going on, and it feels like he's doing exactly what those people did before saying, if you were here in the past, you need to go regardless of the situation. That's echoing some of the evidence that we heard earlier this week from the non-executive director, sub-postmasters. A lot of people are also saying this is hypocritical when he doesn't manage his own team or their behaviour. He has lost the respect and support of a lot of senior leaders in the business by failing to address known issues, allowing unacceptable behaviours and backing poor-performing and inappropriate members of his own team. The common perception that his priority is clinging on to his job by his fingertips rather than actually leading the business in any way, etc. This email, I think it's this email, is then discussed at a board meeting. Could we please turn to poll 004485509? And that's a board meeting on the 5th of July 2023. Am I right to say that that is the email that was discussed at this board meeting?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. We see there that you are in attendance, 5th of July 2023. And the second item, after the welcome and conflicts of interest, etc., is entitled Speak Up. And it says, the chairman spoke to the above materials. There seems to have been an email from the head of investigations and an email from Mr. Fote that were being discussed in this context.
Yes.
Noting the advice provided by Mr. Foughton and Mr. Bartlett, and advised that he had replied to the whistleblower, the chairman shared his view that some of the allegations raised did not appear to be strictly whistleblowing issues, and that it may be in order for the board to consider a different approach to address allegations of this nature. If we scroll over the page, please, we then have Mr. Reid advising that he was of a similar view and set out his perspective on the allegations. Now, just pausing there, do you think it's appropriate for Mr. Reid to be addressing the board in relation to those allegations when, as we've seen, a fair amount of that criticism was directed towards Mr. Reid himself?
Yes, I can see that there may be circumstances where it's inappropriate. However, the whistleblowing was on a variety of topics where we did need the chief executive's input because certain decisions were going to have to be made.
If we scroll down, please, we have some views from yourself over the page. It says there, AB advised that she thought the proposed changes all sounded very sensible, however noted the significant amount of activity going on in the business and that for employees it was not always clear as to what the priorities were. AB queried who would have responsibility for this. Mr. Reid advised that whilst historically this had been T. McInnes, this would be part of the Chief of Staff's role, and that the Chief of Staff would work with the business to undertake a governance and meeting cadence overview to ensure alignment with accountability and decision-making processes. Can you assist us with what your concerns were as expressed there?
That we needed proper organisation. This was going to be a considerable amount of work to look into the whistleblowing allegations, and that we needed to make sure it was sensibly staffed up, because otherwise we would once again add additional workloads to people and they wouldn't necessarily understand what the priorities were. And these allegations were clearly very serious and needed proper focus.
There's a suggestion there that this would be the Chief of Staff's role. Did that happen?
I believe that she does look at the allocation of roles and responsibilities and projects within the organisation.
So investigating the issues wasn't the Chief of Staff's role, it was
No.
their role to decide who would take it forward.
Yeah. Well, to make sure that people had the right bandwidth. If they needed to drop things to be able to help with this investigation, then who was going to take up the work they were doing, for example?
Are you aware of this investigation being undertaken?
Yes.
Has it concluded?
No.
Can you assist us with who is undertaking this investigation?
This particular one is being done by Grant Thornton.
Thank you. If we scroll over to page 5, we see there an action point. SJ, that's Simon Jeffries, advised that the board also needed to appoint a whistleblowing champion. The chairman invited board members to express their interests in this role by way of to the chairman. SJ emphasised the need for the board to make sure an individual with the right profile was appointed for this position. Now, this was the board meeting of the 5th of July. I think you've said that you became whistleblowing champion in August. Did you put yourself forward after this meeting?
I did, yes.
Were you the only person that put yourself forward as far as you're aware?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
And why did you want to take up this role?
I suspected that nobody else would volunteer and it clearly needed to be done. So I thought I would be able to do this role on top of my other roles.
Why do you think others wouldn't volunteer for that role?
Just because of the amount of time everyone was already undertaking in their various roles. I was still relatively new to the organisation, and I had been involved in whistleblowing issues for other organisations, so I did have some background in this regard.
Thank you. Could we please turn to poll 00447,997? This is the Speak Up policy. It's version 9.0. Do you know if this is the most up-to-date version?
It is.
Was it developed prior to you taking up that role?
There was a Speak Up policy in place, but it was revised several times, I think. I think this was May.
Yes, if we scroll over the page and we look at the very bottom, it has, at the very bottom of the page, it says Group Policy Speak Up May 24.
Yeah.
So you've been involved in the drafting of this document or the finalising of this document?
Well, just understanding what it said and whether we needed to make some changes. Yeah.
Could we turn to page 3, please, and it sets out there the core principles. I'll just read out the first few bullet points. It says, the Post Office will treat Speak Up disclosures consistently, fairly, appropriately and professionally, and afford the protections from the Public Interest Disclosure Act. Reporters raising a genuine concern will be protected from reprisals, even if they turn out to be mistaken. Encourage the reporting of any concerns as soon as possible in the knowledge that the Post Office will take all concerns raised seriously and investigate them fully. Concerns will be kept confidential and disclosed only on a need-to-know basis. 3, the Speak Up team will seek to not reveal a reporter's identity outside of the team without the prior agreement of the reporter. However, there may be occasions when details need to be shared, where there is a risk of harm to the reporter or others, or where we need to do so for legal or regulatory reasons, or are required to disclose documents to the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry. Post Office will promote and publicise how staff can raise these concerns, and the Post Office will provide a training and awareness programme to ensure all employees are aware of the Speak Up policy and procedure. Is this a policy just for employees, or does it extend to sub-postmasters?
It does extend to postmasters as well, but I agree that actually on reflection we could be clearer on that. But if you look at the top, it does say that it's the right thing for colleagues and postmasters.
So with regards to actively promoting and publicising, for example, the inquiry has carried out a survey and there were some issues with the knowledge of either the fact that you are able to report a whistleblowing concern or how to. Do you have any future plans in this regard?
Well, obviously, we've already reviewed the survey that was done, and I'll definitely be taking that up, yes. I mean, it is clear that some postmasters do know about the Speak Up because they are speaking up, but obviously we need to do more to make sure that everyone is aware.
Thank you. So that might be an appropriate moment to take our morning break.
All right.
Could we come back at 25:02, please?
Yeah, by all means.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. I'm going to move on to the topic of the dismissal of Mr. Staunton. This is the first time that we have dealt with this in any depth in the inquiry. The allegation that we're going to look at has been dealt with already in a parliamentary committee, and the various names that we're going to deal with has already been dealt with publicly. And I think you've set that out in your witness statement. Who is Jane Davies?
She was the previous Chief People Officer.
Thank you. And I think you've said in your witness statement that your paths had previously crossed.
That's correct, yes.
In June 2023, I think you've said that following a probationary period, she wasn't offered a permanent position at the Post Office.
That's correct.
And you've set out at paragraph 19 that she subsequently wrote to Mr. Staunton, so far as you're aware, and that Mr. Staunton later shared with you and Mr. Tidswell a copy of a draft letter from her solicitors which raised concerns regarding Mr. Reed. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, we won't go through the complaints one by one, but can you assist us in broad terms? What was the nature of the complaints?
The complaints were partly to do with potential discrimination, partly to do with bullying, and partly to do with not dealing with poor performance, amongst others.
You've said in your statement that there was a view that it was shared in an attempt to secure more favourable terms. Can you assist us with who held that view?
Mr. Staunton.
On the 4th of September of 2023, you've said that this became a formal whistleblowing report and that you oversaw the investigation because by that stage you were the Speak Up champion. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. Mr. Staunton asked me to do that role.
Was this entitled Project Rose?
Yes. Rose 2, I think it is.
Thanks.
Sorry, we have so many projects, it's sometimes difficult to remember, but I think it's Rose 2.
You've said in your statement that Lorna Grattan also asked to be involved. Can you assist us with why she wanted to be involved?
Because this related to the chief executive, it was obviously something that was going to be of interest to the shareholder.
And you've set out in your statement that the post office was advised by Pinsent Masons and a barrister, Ms. Tutin. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
You say you became aware that Henry Staunton was also the subject of one of the complaints. The original complaint that you saw hadn't named Mr. Staunton, is that correct?
No, it just referred to a board member making some inappropriate comments.
There came a point at which he became subject to an investigation. Can you assist us with when? If the 4th of September was the whistleblowing report, we know that there was a Teams call in January of 2024. Can you assist us with when it became known to you that Mr. Staunton was part of that complaint?
From memory, it was sometime in November. So it was as a result of Miss Tutin meeting with Miss Davis to go through her complaints.
And how did you come to be aware of that information?
Pinsent Mason informed us.
Did you have, at that point in time, any conversations with any members of the board about that topic?
Miss Grattan was also aware because she was also part of the overseeing process. And we spoke to Mr. Tidswell as the Senior Independent Director, as we felt that we would have to investigate these further allegations and that Mr. Staunton needed to be aware.
And again, in broad terms, what was the nature of those allegations?
It was to do with remarks in relation to a recruitment process for a non-executive director, and they concerned a potential gender matter and a racist matter.
It might be suggested that those complaints against Mr. Staunton were taken further than Miss Davis intended, perhaps to get rid of the chair. What's your view on that?
No, not at all. Clearly, if those comments had been made, they were not appropriate for a very senior person within the organisation, and we felt we absolutely could not ignore the fact that this had now been brought to our attention. It
might be suggested that the complaint was principally and overwhelmingly concerning Mr. Reed's conduct rather than Mr. Staunton's, and that there was undue focus on Mr. Staunton because he didn't fit a particular mould. What's your view on that?
No, that isn't correct. The focus clearly was on Mr. Reed because most of the allegations related to him.
Paragraph 26 of your witness statement, you say that Mr. Staunton made repeated attempts to have the investigation stopped. Can you assist us with the sequence of events there?
Yes, so over several weeks he spoke to myself, to Miss Grattan, to the Chief People Officer, the General Counsel generally being very firm that we should stop the investigation. He did this under the guise that it was causing a great deal of stress to Mr. Reid, and that he felt this was unfair and therefore the investigation should stop.
And why do you say guys?
Because we were obviously also aware that there was an investigation into his own remarks.
And is it your view that he was asking to stop the investigation because it concerned him rather than his concern regarding Mr. Reid?
That thought did cross my mind, yes.
You've described it as a guise, you said it crossed your mind. Is it your belief that that is why?
Yes, it did seem coincidental that as soon as Mr. Staunton had been informed that there was also an investigation into him, that these conversations took place.
And can you please take us through step by step your understanding of what Mr. Staunton is said to have done in respect of trying to stop that investigation?
As I say, he had conversations with a number of people. He also tried to delay his own interview with the barrister.
How do you describe the conversations that he had, so far as you're aware, from discussions with those individuals?
That they were quite of a aggressive nature.
To who?
Particularly to the General Counsel and to the Chief People Officer.
Are you aware of the content of that conversation?
That he was just adamant that the investigation had to stop. And that people were not supportive of management and that they should follow what he recommended.
Is this, for you, just an issue with an individual, or does it say something more significant about the post office as a business?
Bearing in mind the absolute requirement to have a good functioning speak-up facility, it would be entirely inappropriate to stop an investigation once somebody had spoken up. It's really important that the process is followed through, no matter who that relates to. Obviously, it's difficult when more senior people are involved, just because of the nature of it, but you still have to absolutely go through the same process. And so this was not to do with individuals, this was to do with absolutely following the policy.
Irrespective of the particular complaint on this particular occasion, does this incident itself, do you think, tell us anything about the broader business?
I think it tells me something about Mr. Staunton's view of speak-ups. I don't think he necessarily appreciated how important it was that we followed the process.
One matter that you've highlighted in your statement is you've said that there's an issue that the board can't get rid of a chair. What's that concern?
That's to do with the governance arrangements with the shareholder. So it is the shareholder who decides who is appointed and if that person needs to be removed.
Ordinarily, how would you have expected this matter to have been dealt with at board level?
I would have expected that there would have been an ability in the articles for the other directors to be able to agree to remove a director. That's normally what you would see.
And again, looking forward to the future in terms of recommendations, is there anything that you consider there should be changed about the position?
I think it would be appropriate to review the articles and really consider what makes most sense to be kept within the remit of the shareholder and what makes most sense to be kept with the directors. It is quite difficult when you're expected to be a director of a company and be independent, but then have one arm tied behind your back.
Does the same situation apply to the non-executive directors as it does to the chair in terms of removal?
From memory, yes, the shareholder, well, certainly the shareholder approves all appointments, and I am pretty sure has to agree to removals.
Thank you. Can we please turn to poll 00448 This is an email from Mr. Tidswell of the 16th of January of this year to Mr. Staunton, with you copied in. He says, as promised, I've spoken with Amanda. She agrees with my suggestion that it would be sensible in all the circumstances and particularly bearing in mind the intense pressures on Nick for the board to review the allegations raised by Rose about Nick with a view to categorising them, and he sets those out. Just looking at that first paragraph, it does seem, this is prior to Henry Staunton's departure, it does seem as though there was a concern about the pressures on Nick Reed.
Oh, absolutely, which I also shared. This was during the time when obviously there had been the ITV programme. Mr. Reed had to appear before the select committee. There was a lot of media scrutiny. There was a lot of stress within the organisation. And yes, Mr. Reed was under, of course, this investigation going on as well. And it would be very surprising if someone didn't feel under stress in those circumstances.
In those circumstances, how can you be confident as you are with regards to Mr. Staunton's motives?
I think he was genuinely concerned about Mr. Reed.
Is there a but there?
No, I genuinely do think he was concerned about Mr. Reed. Yeah.
But I think your evidence earlier was that that wasn't his principal motivation.
That was my opinion, but I also definitely think he was concerned about Nick, yes.
Number one, allegations where we think there is documentary evidence which is sufficiently unequivocal that Marianne Tutin, the barrister, can be asked to confirm her conclusions without the need to interview Nick. The most obvious applies to the 2 points about the bonus multiplier, which I looked at in detail from my interview, and where the documents are plain in showing the allegation is wrong. Very briefly, what was the issue about the bonus multiplier?
That was the matter that I referred to earlier, when there had been, the process hadn't been entirely followed to get shareholder consent. But that was actually all well documented. So I think that was behind Mr. Tidwell's thinking that because there was a clear document trail, that perhaps we could narrow down some of the things that Ms. Tutin was going to interview him about, because at this stage, Mr. Reed had not been interviewed.
2 allegations where the subject matter is not of sufficient significance to warrant an investigation process. This might, without wanting to second-guess the board, include items such as Angela Williams working for 2 companies for a period, which was common knowledge, and the decision to award her good leaver status, which may fall into one above. The board may then feel comfortable in asking Marianne not to continue to investigate these matters. Again, very briefly, what were those matters?
This was Miss Williams, who was the interim CPO. She was due to leave the organisation and was asked to stay on for a period, by which time she'd already taken on a position in another company. So I understand that Mr. Reed agreed she could try and juggle the 2 jobs for a period.
Number 3, allegations not falling into 1 or 2 above, which may still need some degree of investigation, but which ought to be relatively limited in number and scope, and perhaps can be managed with Nick more easily. Amanda makes the point that Marianne is carrying out a dual exercise of gathering material to defend the claim, which we understand has been issued. Presumably, Nick would be happy to discuss items in 1 or 2 if she needed his input, as long as it was understood they were no longer matters under investigation. Can you assist us? Was it an independent investigation that was being carried out by the barrister, or was it something else?
No, this was an independent investigation.
And can an independent investigation be carried out whilst also gathering material to defend a claim?
This perhaps is slightly clumsy wording. What was meant by this was that it was the same issues were raised for the employment tribunal. So rather than creating two lots of work, the purpose was to make sure that the same points were covered.
Could we, thank you. And it then says, if you think this might be workable and valuable in reassuring Nick, I think the next step is to get Lorna involved, etc. This then brings us, in terms of the dates, we're also at the same time as what we know as Project Pineapple. Could we please turn to poll 00448-300, and it's page 2. Over the page, please. Thank you very much. So this is going on at a very similar time when we're back a couple of days, January the 14th now. In your view, should we read in anything to the timing of the Project Pineapple email to the issues that we've just been discussing?
I don't believe so.
Do you consider this Project Pineapple email to be a whistleblowing complaint?
It certainly raises grievances.
And under your policy, of which you've been involved, would it qualify as a whistleblowing complaint?
We did not treat it as that. Instead, it went through a grievance process through HR.
And why is that?
Because we felt these were grievances being raised by Mr. Ismail and Mr. Jacobs.
It says there, SAF said the views expressed by Richard Taylor and previously by management and even members of the board still persisted, that those postmasters who had not come forward to be exonerated were guilty as charged. Something needs to be done. He then names other individuals. Martin Roberts and certain members of his team were singled out. Equally, Saf and Elliott are fed up with the amount of power wielded by Ben Fote. Do those matters qualify as whistleblowing complaints?
Potentially they could be, but as I say, we consider them to be a grievance.
What do you see as the difference between a whistleblowing complaint and a grievance?
The grievance will be to do with issues like bullying or other sort of HR matters, and this seemed to us to be more to do with how people were behaving in the organisation.
A fundamental cultural issue about presuming that sub-postmasters are guilty as charged. Do you consider that to be a grievance or a matter for the whistleblowing policy?
I think it could fall into either category, to be honest.
The reason I ask is we know that this email was subsequently forwarded by Mr. Reid to individuals who were named in the email. Do you see that as a breach of the confidentiality obligations of your Speak Up policy? If not in letter, at least in theory.
Yes.
Because I think you have raised issues of, for example, Mr. Staunton's disclosure to Parliament in relation to Miss Davis's complaint. Isn't disclosure, it might be said that disclosure of this email is very much in a similar category to that?
Yes, it was immensely unfortunate.
And do you think those actions, for whatever reason, might discourage others from coming forward?
Potentially, and we were also concerned about the complaints against Mr. Reid being made public for the same reason. So we did put out a communication to everyone to reassure them that this is not the normal process, and our expectation is to keep things confidential until the moment when there might be a reason to make something public.
Were things going quite wrong in mid-January 2024?
it was certainly a very difficult period.
Could we turn, please, to poll 00448 This is the email that we've seen before from Mr. Staunton to the non-executive directors. He says, Nick confirmed that he had sent the confidential note to the independent non-executive directors entitled Project Pineapple to Ben and Martin, amongst others. This note contains the private comments of our postmaster non-executive directors, and this email also addresses the fact that Nick was under huge pressures, a lot on his mind. He understands it was a serious lapse and was very apologetic. Were you aware of any apology being made to the sub-postmaster non-executive directors?
I know that the postmaster non-executive directors definitely wanted an apology from Mr. Reid, and I understand they feel they did not get one.
So,
I think he did it more in the context of the circumstances in which he accidentally forwarded the note.
Are you aware of any corrective action within the business to make sure that this kind of issue doesn't crop up again?
Well, unfortunately, it's almost impossible to prevent someone forwarding something that they shouldn't do. What is important is for people to pause a moment before they press the send button and make sure they see what the attachments are.
Does this once again go to some sort of an overall cultural issue within the organisation?
As I say, the organisation has been under huge stress. Mr. Reid himself was very stressed at this point. And I just think he just sent it without really realising what was attached. He hadn't meant to send the embedded attachments.
If that can come down, on the same day, an issue arose regarding the appointment of the senior independent director. You've addressed that at paragraph 44 of your witness statement. Can you briefly explain to us what the issue was there?
Yes, Mr. Tidwell, who was the senior independent director at the time, had given notice that he intended to leave the post office, and so it would be necessary to find a replacement. Now, that replacement could either be someone internal or appointment of a new person. The shareholder advised the board that they wanted this person to be externally appointed and to have some sort of government type background.
And what was the view of the chair?
In the initial discussions at the board, the chair agreed to that, but he then seemed to change his mind.
And do you know why?
He said it was because there were so many issues facing the post office that we didn't need yet another matter which would involve people being distracted in interviewing, etc., and so felt it would be more appropriate to appoint somebody internally.
Was your view that that view was legitimately held?
I could absolutely understand the rationale for trying to reduce the number of things that were going on in the post office because there were just huge amounts. However, there had been a very, very clear steer from the shareholder as to what they wanted, and it seemed to me that this was not the moment to, I think I said the words, pick a fight with the shareholder.
If we could bring onto screen your witness statement, WITN 11330100. It's paragraph 45, page 13, that I'd like to ask you about. Thank you. Page 13, paragraph 45. You say there, I had various discussions with Mr. Tidswell and Miss Grattan, as this was yet another example of Mr. Staunton's inappropriate conduct. It is well accepted that cultural change starts at the top. The post office was in the very unfortunate position of having a chair of the board who was acting contrary to best practice. Can you expand upon that, please?
Yes, well, we've already discussed the issues in relation to Mr. Staunton trying to persuade people to stop the investigation into Mr. Reid. He had also, I had been told, shouted at the General Council in an open plan situation so other staff could see. And he'd had various conversations with the Chief People Officer, which had led her to consider that she might need to resign.
Thank you. We have heard this week from the sub-postmaster non-executive directors who broadly paint a positive picture of Mr. Staunton's commitment to in the involvement of sub-postmasters, for example. Why do you think it is that there is this gulf of views with regards to Mr. Staunton?
I think it is correct. Mr. Staunton absolutely wanted a better future for the postmasters. He wanted resolution of the historical compensation process. I completely agree with all those comments. I don't think we're inconsistent in that.
The suggestion might be made that he was more on the side of the postmasters than other members of the board, and that it's effectively the establishment getting rid of him. What's your view as to that?
No, I don't think that's correct. As I say, I genuinely believe he wanted to do the best for the postmasters, but I think he got very frustrated with the fact that we're a public corporation and some of the policies and processes we have to follow, and perhaps wasn't the right person for this particular role.
Thank you. I'd like to move on quickly to past roles and Phoenix. Can we bring up onto screen poll 00448-297? This is an email that we've seen from Mr. Jacobs, raising concerns that current employees who are still in the business and were involved in the Horizon scandal are still employed. There's another number of emails along the same lines chasing up action. It seems as though action is not taken, certainly in their view, swiftly. Were you aware of the differences between past roles and Phoenix?
Not initially. I think it was all a little bit confused as to what we were actually talking about. So it did take a while for the board to understand that there were two different types of people.
And in your view, was there sufficient priority given to both of those projects?
No, I think we could have been a lot quicker. I think this was a very difficult topic, but at some point, decisions have to be made.
And looking at the present day, do you think there has been sufficient action taken in that regard?
It is definitely improving.
What's your view of the suspend now proposal that was put forward by Mr. Ismail and Mr. Jacobs this week?
I think, it depends on the individual concerned. As you know, there are a range of different employees involved in these matters, and I think it would be very unfair for some, and others it might be more appropriate.
I mean, there are some names that we've heard mentioned where it's certainly in the view of the sub-postmaster non-executive directors, they would clearly fall within a category of wrongdoers. Why do you think they haven't been suspended?
I think because the people team have been going through a particular process and didn't feel that there was sufficient information to warrant a suspension.
Have you heard the term untouchables being used by Mr. Reid?
I have.
And what was your understanding as to that term at the time it was used?
I heard it in relation to the 18th of January meeting from this year. From memory, the context was Mr. Staunton said something like, as Nick describes, there are certain people who are untouchables, and Mr. Reid agreed with that comment.
So in your view, the term came from Mr. Staunton rather than Mr. Reid?
Yes, but I think he was quoting Mr. Reid.
Ah, thank you. And what did you understand that to mean?
I understood that there was, again, confusion as to quite what this referred to, and there seemed to be different names attached to it. But it seemed to suggest that there were certain people who were above normal policies and processes, and that action wouldn't be taken against them if action was necessary.
And in your understanding, who did that relate to?
On the 18th January, the reference was to Mr. Bartlett.
And was there another occasion when it was in reference to somebody else?
I believe it was in relation to potentially the previous investigators.
Have you personally done anything to challenge that?
It's definitely not a... I know there was concern as to whether this was a sort of word used generally in the organisation, and I have definitely not heard it anywhere else. And in my personal view, you definitely can't have people who are untouchable. That is just makes a very unhealthy organisation if that's the case.
And as Speak Up champion, have you done anything to see whether there is any substance to that allegation?
Well, the very fact that we are running multiple investigations into people, and indeed investigated the allegations in relation to the chair and the chief executive, I would hope would underpin confidence that there are no people who are untouchable.
On a related subject, looking at the investigations and the investigations team, we've heard evidence, for example, from Mr. Jacobs, who was subject to an investigation himself. Who is responsible for oversight of that investigations team, so far as you're aware?
It was the General Counsel.
Do you consider that the board has sufficient oversight in respect of, for example, the recovery of apparent or alleged shortfalls?
I think it's something we definitely need to review. The board as a whole is getting more information now, and there are regular updates to the board around the number of investigations. But I think it would really benefit us to sort of really stand back and review some of the processes.
You'll have seen in your pack in preparation for today various correspondence between Mr. Reid and Fujitsu regarding the provision of witness evidence in criminal proceedings. Was that something that you were aware of before preparing for the inquiry?
Yes. I don't think I saw that correspondence, but from memory, Mr. Woodley did describe the correspondence to the board.
And what is your view now, having seen that correspondence, of the approach that was taken by Post Office investigators?
I think we should look at some of the language that's used, and I think people just need to stand back and understand what it is they're trying to achieve. We do need to get a balance in terms of being confident that where that actually has been wrongdoing and the police want to look into something, that we are able to provide evidence to the police. I think we need to get that better into balance.
And what in particular are your concerns relating to the particular correspondence that you've seen?
I think although the term victim would be understood, in the criminal context, I think just in the fact we have got our own background to this, we just need to really review how we approach things.
Thank you. I'm just going to deal with a few small miscellaneous topics before we finish, and before I move on to sub-postmaster questions. Governance issues, Grant Thornton. Were you aware of any changes being made to the Grant Thornton report before it was finalised?
As you'd expect, a draft was put before the board, and I also saw the draft of the remuneration element, because obviously I'm very interested in that. And we were given an opportunity to comment, and if we thought that some of the information was incorrect, to ask Grant Thornton to reconsider. And that is entirely what you would expect in these sort of reports. So that process happened.
Is there any content that was changed that you consider the inquiry should be aware of or concerned about?
I think the first report was actually just too long, and we also wanted to focus on the actions that were going to come out of it.
Are there any aspects of that report that you don't agree with?
From memory, no. I have adopted all the proposals for the Remuneration Committee. As I mentioned before, we now have a tracker for the numerous corporate governance proposals for remuneration.
Moving on to NBIT, have you seen the results in the YouGov survey regarding technical issues still being experienced by sub-postmasters?
I've had a very, very quick look. Unfortunately, I've had a very busy week for other companies, but yes, I did have a quick look.
Have you seen or heard about the concerns raised by Mr. Jacobs and Mr. Ismail about the current system as well?
In their evidence?
Yes.
No, I haven't been able to watch all their evidence, I'm afraid.
The kinds of issues that have been identified, ongoing issues with the Horizon system, is that something that you have been made aware of at board level?
Yes, we are aware of issues. I would also say it would be highly, in my experience, highly unusual if there weren't issues with computer systems. That is partly the nature of the beast. I think what's more concerning is how those issues are dealt with.
With regard to the new system, what are the key issues that you're aware of that are of concern to the board?
Well, there's a broad one in terms of usability. It's a very, very old-fashioned system. It wouldn't help us moving to a more digital world, for example. It's not user-friendly. We couldn't sort of allow customers to input their own data into it, for example. So there's lots of things from a sort of practical commercial point of view. It really does need changing. There are issues with, I believe, screen freezes, etc.
Sorry, you're talking about the Horizon system?
Yeah.
In terms of the NBIT system, the new system.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
What are the concerns of the board?
There are various concerns. One, that it's overrun on budget. Two, that it's taken much longer than we were expecting. And three, that some of the back-end processes are not as they should be.
I think the inquiry had understood from submissions made in October 2022 that the Post Office planned on retiring Horizon by 2024. And there's a document in your bundle, I don't think we need to get it up onto screen, but by the 21st of November of 2023, the Post Office sought to extend the Horizon contract to 2030. Can you assist us with what caused that change of circumstance?
Yes, there had been some external reports into the system as it was being developed, which made us pause for thought as to the direction on insourcing, outsourcing, etc. And these are quite fundamental issues which need time to be addressed. and obviously we felt we would need the further support of Fujitsu for a further period to allow us to get into a better place.
Who do you consider has ultimate responsibility for, on the one hand, the delay, and on the second hand, the cost of the new system? And how both of those are out of line with original projections?
Well, the ultimate responsibility is the board.
And is it your view that the board failed to properly scrutinise those issues, that they were provided with incorrect information, or something else?
I think we were not given the right information in terms of the complexity of some of the issues facing NBIT, and therefore the knock-on consequences of time and money.
And who didn't provide the correct information?
People in the IT team.
Is there anybody in particular?
I'm not hugely familiar with the IT team, so I'm sorry, but I think Dravko Malevinek would have been one name.
Thank you. I think we have the full spelling of that name.
Sorry, yes, I'm sure I've mispronounced it.
Compensation and redress. You've said in your statement you're pleased that the government has moved to exonerate all postmasters and the speed of the compensation process. Do you know what steps have been taken by the Post Office to identify those who were prosecuted who haven't yet come forward?
Yes, communications are going out to a broader audience to try and see if we can capture those who haven't made a claim so far.
Do you think the steps that have been taken so far are sufficient?
I'm sure there's always more that can be done. I would hope, though, with the publicity generally around this matter, that postmasters who haven't yet made a claim are now fully aware they can do so.
One entirely miscellaneous question. It relates to paragraph 51 of your statement, where you say that there are too many versions of the contract. What do you mean by that?
This is the franchise agreement with postmasters. You would expect there just to be one, but there seem to be numerous ones, which I don't think is, and also potentially not entirely known who signed what, so that obviously is not appropriate.
And has that been addressed?
Not yet, no. I would hope that following the strategic review, once we know what direction we're going in, then we will be able to revisit what is an appropriate modern franchise agreement.
Quite a lot of emphasis today has been placed on the strategic review and what it may offer. When is that going to be taking place?
We've had a very first high-level look at it very recently. More work is being done, and then we will be consulting with the shareholder, because it's really important we get the shareholders' agreement.
Are we talking months, years?
No, hopefully by the end of this year.
Thank you. Sir, I don't have any further questions. I know that there are questions from Mr. Henry and Mr. Jacobs.
All right, let them ask them.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Miss Burton, you would agree that the degradation of the sub-postmasters by wrongful prosecution or fraudulent civil suit is an atrocious chapter in the Post Office's history.
I certainly would.
And so, therefore, this inquiry is examining the Post Office's turpitude, its myriad wrongdoing, and its failure over many years to treat the sub-postmasters with dignity and justice. You would agree?
I agree.
And knowing that, when the inquiry's subject matter is the raw material of human misery and how the Post Office inflicted that, how could it ever be appropriate for very senior management to be enriched with bonuses arising from an examination into the Post Office's own wrongdoing?
This was a new team that had been brought in who were not there at the time that these awful events happened. And I understand it was felt important that they absolutely focused on what was required to ensure that the inquiry could undertake the job in hand.
New team or not, how could it ever be thought right that very senior management be rewarded for cooperating with the inquiry? An inquiry into the Post Office's historic and arguably continuing misfeasance.
As I say, I wasn't there when the metric was set, but the Remuneration Committee felt it was an appropriate metric at that. Have I just gone quiet? At that stage, this was a public inquiry, not a statutory inquiry. Definitely by the time it became a statutory inquiry, it was not appropriate.
Well, irrespective of whether it was a non-statutory or statutory inquiry, nobody questioned the propriety of the scheme, did they?
As I understand it, no.
And it was only until after there had been public outrage, after the publication of the annual report and accounts, that there was then a realization that this was potentially misconceived. Would you agree?
I would.
But you were still then of the view, at the time of finalising your report, that such an incentive scheme was acceptable, weren't you?
Not that particular sub-metric, but the rest of it, yes, which was not to do with the inquiry.
But the bonus metric you accept should never have been countenanced so far as that specific factor was concerned, regardless of whether the inquiry was statutory or not.
I'm sorry, I don't think I entirely followed your question, sorry.
Well, I thought I understood, and forgive me if I'm wrong, that it is now with hindsight that you say the bonus metric for alleged cooperation with the inquiry should not have been countenanced, and that is regardless of whether the inquiry was on a statutory footing or not.
Correct.
Right. Now, how did this happen? Because the predicate for the bonus, that the inquiry metric had been achieved and had been endorsed no less by the chairman of the inquiry, and this was grossly inaccurate, wasn't it?
It was.
And anyone paying the slightest attention during the whole process of devising or constructing this incentive or checking the annual report and accounts ought to have realised this.
They should.
Yet, and correct me if I'm wrong, you never reached a conclusion on how these serious misrepresentations were made, not least, of course, that the chairman had signed off on the metric. Did you?
No.
No. So there is no explanation in your report on how a multitude of very senior executives, the board and its advisors, Remco in particular, allowed this to happen with blatantly false information being published in the annual report and accounts.
That's correct. I couldn't find any reason for it.
Now, I know that you were unassisted, but you must have asked these questions. Did you encounter opposition, or did you encounter blank faces with people saying, I can't remember? The fact that you reached no conclusion on this matter calls into question the efficacy of the study you conducted.
No one was able to explain to me why they had missed it. I did ask the question, and everyone accepted. They just didn't focus on it. I do not know why.
So it looks, from the complexity and the intricacy of all of the equations, etc., that an enormous amount of time was devoted to constructing this, yet nobody can explain to you why this serious error occurred.
Correct.
Now, can you help me? Is it not right that the Post Office retained Herbert Smith Freehills to review the transformation and incentive scheme regarding bonuses for work on the inquiry?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
You don't know? Well, they certainly were the Post Office's lawyers at the time, and were the Post Office's lawyers and had been for some considerable time in various guises, including lawyers to the inquiry. Do I take it from your answer that you did not consider asking who the solicitors were who reviewed and, as it were, fact-checked this scheme?
I don't think lawyers did fact-check the scheme when it was put in place.
So they didn't, as it were, ask for it to be reviewed so that it was legally appropriate?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
I see. Now, but it follows that you can offer no explanation for these serious errors, including the misrepresentation that the inquiry had concluded and that Sir Wyn Williams had personally approved the metric.
No, I have not been able to find any explanation.
Right. Now, this all makes for, at the very least, and I use understatement, an undignified spectacle. Wouldn't you agree?
I would.
Because these are very important legal documents, the annual report and accounts, and they severely misrepresented the facts.
In that particular instance, absolutely.
And scrutiny, it appears, came there none, and it's troubling on many levels, you would agree.
I would.
Crass errors of judgment, propriety, and very serious errors of fact.
Correct.
And you say, and it's an answer that you have given on numerous occasions this morning to Mr. Blake, that this is a sign of an organisation under some stress.
Yes, that would certainly be one factor, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, of course, I ask you now to consider the other side of the equation. The postmasters, the sub-postmasters need no education in stress, do they?
Absolutely not.
Difficult to trust anyone again when all you've ever had has been taken away from you after you've been falsely accused, wrongly imprisoned, or bankrupted.
I agree.
And the plight of the sub-postmasters, the vast majority of whom are yet to receive full and fair compensation, is both painful and financially precarious.
Agreed.
So while such incentive schemes were being constructed and devised, the sub-postmasters were living on food banks and charity. Many of them. You would agree?
Yes.
And I suggest that this, rather being a speedy process, is an attritional process, which, and I don't suggest that you know this personally, but it's an attritional process, these three schemes, two of which are overseen by the Post Office, which is designed to drive sub-postmasters to settle at a loss. Has that ever been the subject of discussions at board level?
No.
Has anybody properly considered, without, of course, descending into the detail of individual cases, but has anybody properly considered the nature of the process and what is being done in the Post Office's name?
In relation to the compensation?
Yes.
Yes, there is a whole team looking at it.
Right. So do you think it's appropriate that in one case, and I won't mention her name at this stage, that the Post Office is requiring not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 expert reports into a person's medical condition?
I'm sorry, I'm not able to comment because I don't know the detail.
I don't think that's capable of an answer, Mr. Henry.
So be it, sir. I'll move on. But let us deal with something which I hope you will be able to answer. You recognise, surely, the unfortunate perspective the unfairness, at least in the eyes of the sub-postmasters, that the board was devising a TIS such as this, while many of the post office's victims have had to turn to a charitable fund to have their bills paid?
The purpose of this particular part of the scheme was to ensure that everything was done to make sure all the evidence necessary for the inquiry was put in place and handed over. So I don't actually see that as contradictory.
Well, we know, unfortunately, given the timescale of this inquiry and the constant disruption to its progress, that certainly was not accomplished. But in conclusion, this, please. You say that there has been an apology to the sub-postmasters for this metric. We know that there has been an apology to the chairman and to the inquiry team. But can you please point me to an apology to the sub-postmaster corps participants in relation to this TIS?
I don't believe there'll be one in those terms, no.
Thank you.
Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Burton, good afternoon. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters. Sorry. Can you hear me now, Ms. Burton?
I can.
I'll say that again. Good afternoon. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters. I want to ask you about the YouGov survey. Gavin Ellison gave evidence from YouGov on Monday, the 23rd. Have you read that survey or heard about it?
I have, I say, read it in broad terms, and it was discussed at a board meeting.
Thank you. So about 100 current sub-postmasters responded, so 1,000 I ought to say. You'll know then that in the executive summary, we don't need to turn it up, 92% of those who responded said they'd experienced some form of issue with Horizon in the last 12 months. 98% of those who'd experienced discrepancies reported shortfalls, and the most common resolution of those was either for them to use branch money or the sub-postmasters resolve it themselves. 70% suffered from screen freezes, 68% loss of connection, 57% say unexplained discrepancies occurred in their branches, and just to round off, 65% of sub-postmasters who responded said they experienced issues with Horizon at least once a month, and 35% said it was a few times a month. Does that sound familiar?
It does.
From your understanding of the report. So the clear message then is that a very significant representative sample of current sub-postmasters say that the problems with the Horizon system, which Mr. Justice Fraser identified, haven't gone away. Do you agree with that?
It certainly looks like that from the feedback that was given in the survey.
Right. And you said that this was discussed at a board meeting. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, we had a board meeting that was already planned this Tuesday, and obviously this survey had just come out, so it was on the agenda to look at it and understand what we were going to do about it, because obviously the results of the survey were disappointing.
Yes, and this Tuesday, is that Tuesday the 24th of September?
Yes.
This one just gone. That was the day when Saf Ismail gave evidence, and we asked him about this survey, and we said, we asked him if he knew if the Post Office Board or senior executives before the survey came out were aware of the huge dissatisfaction amongst sub-postmasters with how the Horizon system is working and how they're being treated by the Post Office. And he said the board is certainly not aware to the level that the YouGov survey broke things down and the specific points. He said that what the board tends to be told in terms of current and existing bugs, for example, is there are a number of bugs, will be fixed X number of bugs, and there's no specific detail. Is that correct? Does that accord with your view of the sort of information you're given?
Yes.
And that's helpful, thank you. And he went on to say, importantly, the executive, the wider executive, is cherry-picking what information it gives to the board, which he said is not helpful. Would you agree with that as well?
To be honest, it's very difficult to know what you don't know. So I think there can be some instances where perhaps information is given in a certain way, and other times actually it's very honest information.
But there is a concern, Ms. Burton, isn't there, that the board is still not receiving accurate information from the executive in relation to sub-postmaster issues?
It certainly seems that there is an issue following these survey results, although, to be fair, the postmaster survey we did earlier in the year that the board looked at also raised issues around dissatisfaction with their own remuneration, for example. So we haven't just heard it from here that there are issues generally. We are aware of them.
And Mr. Ismail also said it was part of his evidence that the employee surveys, he didn't feel that the board were receiving information from the executive that was presented in a helpful or accurate way.
Well, I think, again, the employee engagement surveys are very helpful, and we actually felt that they were properly presented to the board.
What can the board do, or what should the board do, about these very real concerns, we say, that the executive is cherry-picking the information that gets passed on to the board?
Definitely continue to do surveys, also actual visits to branches to speak to postmasters ourselves, and to talk to a wider group of people. To be absolutely honest, in any organisation, there is a danger that things get filtered upwards. And as a non-executive director, I think we're always alive to that, and therefore have to find other ways to do checks and balances to assure ourselves that we are being given the right information.
It must be important, don't you think, that in an organisation where there have been deceptions and misrepresentations by senior executive members, it must be important in terms of changing culture that something is done to ensure that the executive today is candid and transparent in its dealings with the board. Do you accept that?
I do.
And do you have any ideas as to what can be done in relation to the executive in particular?
I think we need to make it very clear that we must receive the right information, and it mustn't be filtered in any way. And to see sort of the next tier down as well, so not just rely on the senior management. I think that's good practice for a number of reasons. To have wider engagement with postmasters and mistresses as well. And I do think that the fact we have postmaster NEDs is really critical, and I really welcome their role.
Thank you, that's helpful. I just have one other point arising from an answer you gave to Mr. Blake at about 12:15 this afternoon. You were asked about sub-postmasters who have been prosecuted but haven't yet come forward. And you said that that communications have been sent to a broad audience. Could you just elaborate on that, please?
I understand letters they either have gone out or are going out to as many people as we understand were postmasters and mistresses during that period.
And so the broad audience would be people who were postmasters during that time. Thank you, that's helpful. Yeah. I don't have any further questions, sir.
Can I ask you, Ms. Burton, in relation to persons who are entitled to be exonerated under the recent legislation, if I can put it in that way, is the process of identifying and notifying them being handled solely by the Ministry of Justice, or jointly with Post Office and the Ministry of Justice, or what, if I can put it in that way, is the process for notifying these people?
I'm afraid I don't know, Sir Wynne.
Fine. All right. Thank you.
So,
No doubt I'll find out from somewhere else.
so there's just a question from Miss Patrick.
Right? Yeah.
Good morning, Miss Burton. My name's Miss Patrick, and I think, I represent another group of sub-postmasters who were convicted and have since been acquitted. Since had their convictions quashed. I just want to ask you about one part of your witness statement because you haven't been asked about it before. And you've just confirmed with Mr. Jacobs your view that the addition of sub-postmaster Neds to the board is a helpful thing.
Yes.
And I just want to look at one issue that arose, and it's been being called the two-tier approach to the board. And in your witness statement, you deal with that, and you say that when you joined the board, it's at para 59 of your statement, you recognised that only those who could sit on particular committees could get papers. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that meant that some were excluded from seeing all of the materials that were being circulated to some members of the board.
That's correct, and that included myself.
Yeah. And in fact, it came to pass that you discussed that with the chair and the company secretary. Is that right?
I did.
And on consulting Mr. Staunton, you said Mr. Staunton said access could be given to independent NEDs. And you said that meant that Miss Grattan, although she wasn't independent, sat on all of the committees and also got the papers. But what that meant was that the change meant that neither Mr. Ishmael nor Mr. Jacobs were getting papers for committees they didn't sit on.
That's correct.
And the committee included the Remuneration Committee. There were never any SPM representatives on the Remuneration Committee, were there?
No.
Now, was that kind of two-tier approach indicative of the continuing possible apparent belief that there was some suspicion afforded to the role that an SPM might play in the business?
I agree it was not helpful.
And has that now changed?
It has.
And is that as a result of the recommendations made by the Grant Thornton report?
No, actually. Because I was having conversations with Mr. Ismail and Mr. Jacobs about some remuneration issues, I realised that they still couldn't see the papers that I could see. So I asked again whether it was possible for them to also get those papers, and that has now been agreed. And much more recently, it's also been agreed that any of us can attend any committee meeting, even if we're not a member, and we can attend as an observer, and that will also apply to the Remuneration Committee.
And the Grant Thornton work did recognise that this kind of two-tier approach was unhelpful, didn't it?
It did.
And recommended changes to remedy that.
It did.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Thank you, Ms. Patrick. Is that it, Mr. Blake?
It is, yes, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Burton, for your witness statement and for attending to give oral evidence. I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you.
So could we come back at 10 to 2?
What's the time now?
It's
Yes, certainly. Yes, certainly. Yeah, fine.
Thank you very much.